13, as well as the Williams Treaties. And these lands continue to be home for many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And as a settler, I'm grateful to live and work here today. And we encourage everyone out there on this virtual convening to reflect on the lands you're tuning in from today, its Indigenous keepers, the treaties that govern it, or if it's unceded. Now, before we get into today's discussion, I have a few quick announcements. We have another virtual convening coming up, so save the date. On Feb 26th, we're going to host an interactive discussion with Irina Mihalish and my ROM colleague, Courtney Murfin, because for the past year, they've been conducting studies on the field of interpretation, how far the field has come, where it's going, where it needs to go. We're going to add that registration link to the chat so you can sign up at your leisure. As always, these events are made possible by the generous support of museum folk like you. So if you can, please donate via the Pay What You Wish button on our website, which we'll also add to the chat. As always, Chatham House rules apply to our convenings. This means you're free to use the information received, but speakers and other participants should be kept anonymous. And on that anonymous note, you can add your anonymous questions to the private chat to AMI at any time during this discussion. For public comments, please use the raise hand function when we get to the Q&A. And today's panel discussion is on inclusive interpretive practice. It's the culmination of 6 years of evaluations at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And our speakers today are Sarupa Anila, my boss and Senior VP of Exhibition and Gallery Development at the ROM, and our president of AMI, alongside Cecilia Garibay of the Garibay Group and Ken Morris, who's Director of Visitor Research and Evaluation of the DEAI. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarupa.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Megan and AMI for organizing us, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this late Friday afternoon. I want to express special thanks to Cecilia and Ken for joining here and sharing this this report and study with us. We do want this to be conversational and open for discussion. I'm thrilled to see familiar faces in our participant crowd, some new ones. So we do want to create some space for us to have a conversation. I'm going to run the PowerPoint, but I did want to first say that we're covering some very complex and in some ways convoluted ground today. So bear with us, but it's interesting. It will be interesting to hear your reflections on what we're talking through. So before coming to the Royal Ontario Museum, I was at the Detroit Institute of Arts for many years as a colleague to Ken Morris, and worked with Cecilia Garibay for many projects. We brought in Garibay Group, for which Cecilia is principal, in to conduct some front-end evaluations for us. And we did many projects. And so as an overview, we engaged Cecilia for about 8 years on different kinds of projects, had focus groups, but we're not going to talk about those findings. What we did was to go back and develop a study of the findings from those many projects. And that metasynthesis is what we're going to be talking about today. It was, as we talked about, it's a pretty groundbreaking study, but not in many ways particularly revolutionary in terms of the findings. Some of the things that Cecilia, Ken, and I were talking about ahead of this conversation was we found ourselves in an interesting tension between talking about what those findings are and wanting to talk about organizational or institutional change. And what you're going to hear, some of what you're going to hear is going to feel sort of straightforward, almost quaint. They're not things that you haven't heard, particularly in the moment we're in, where museums are developing DEI strategic plans with breakneck speed, and we're entering more and more critical discussions about power, anti-oppression, anti-racism work, decolonizing practice. So what we're going to hear is over the course of several years before this particular 2020 moment that we've just passed through. And so a big question is, when you see some of these findings, why is there still resistance? And where does that come from? So with that, I'm going to open us up for the conversation and look forward to reflections at the end. And I will ask Ken to get us going.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you today and to be involved in this with my colleagues, Sarupa and Cecilia. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about front-end studies and focus groups. And so when we talk about front-end studies, that's just some systematic way of collecting information early in the process of developing an exhibition that helps move the process forward. So there are questions that we're involved in early on, and Sarupa will go to the next slide if that's okay. So there are questions that we're involved in early on, and I should mention that this usually happens in the early concept phase. And so among the things that we're doing we're looking to answer questions that the team has and get information that helps the team think about an interpretive plan. So for example, at this point in the process, they're already maybe a rough big idea. Maybe there's a rough idea of what the visitor outcomes are. Maybe the team has already identified some themes, and they have some idea about the works and maybe even the groupings. Now, what happens in the course of front end is that those things, those ideas, those early concepts get tested with audience, prospective audience, stakeholders, folks that I sometimes call them a special audience, but they're people, community members that may feel like the content reflects on them or that the content belongs to them, right? So there's several methods that might be used for front-end studies. It might be that you're doing interviews with audience members. It might be that you're doing interviews with community members. You might do focus groups. You might do town hall meetings. And for the work we did, we used the term focus groups, but often we talk about this and think that maybe we should be using a different term. But generally we're referring to facilitated conversations in which we are introducing content, introducing early themes. But what we're doing is we're hearing from people what their reactions are to it, what things confuse them, what questions they have. There are times that we put information in front of people or put concepts in front of people, the community members, and they identify themes that the team didn't see. And so with that, I'm going to just pass it on to Cecilia to talk about, for us to get deeper into this.
Thank you, Ken, and I'm so pleased to be here. I want to just take a moment maybe to, as Ken said, deepen a little bit of this notion of the way in which we approach this work and this front end evaluation, and often what we think about as focus groups. And I guess where I want to start is maybe a little bit from offering a little bit of a methodological sort of perspective. you often, when we think about evaluation and research also, we tend to move to methods. And so you can see that here we were using the shorthand even at the very beginning when we began work with the DEAI, is this notion of focus groups. And so for many disciplines in visitor studies or marketing or so forth, you think about focus groups or even surveys as a very specific thing. And we tend to think about them as a method that you can just kind of sort of a cookie cutter where you can just take that method and replicate it. And we often forget about maybe the more salient aspects of underlying our values or orientation. Certainly from where I sit as a researcher and evaluator, how do I come to the work? How do I show up to the work? How do my values and perspectives inform that work? So within our Garibay Group team and the work we do, we often talk about our research is grounded in culturally responsive approaches, which essentially are rooted in critical race theory and social justice orientations. And so the way that we think about our work is very different than potentially an organization who does great work in marketing and uses the same method. And so what you see here on the slide is a little bit of sort of a way of giving you some quick points in terms of how that paradigm, here I'm referencing Donna Merton's work in terms of thinking about transformative paradigms and what is at the core of the ways that we both approach a study, design the study, and then carry it out. And you can see here a central concern is really issues of equity. And so we're always attending to issues of power differentials, thinking about what has led to marginalization, and with that frame, thinking about community members as collaborators rather than subjects, which is a much more of a traditional research perspective, right? And we emphasize a lot of building trust and relationships and thinking about how we do that. So these tend to be less the 60-minute encounters that you might think about in a focus group setting, and they tend to be about 3 hours long and often over time. So in this particular photo that you see, the reason that one I think for me has particular resonance is that is actually an add-on to a set of conversations that we were having with community. This particular group were Indigenous community members from the Detroit area, and we ended including a design charrette as part of a second phase of study with that particular community, because of the issues that emerged and the power and relationship commitment that we had, right? The commitment to continuing those relationships and really attending to power that we added on. So there's also a flexibility component of that. So I just wanted to name those issues because these orientations, I think, in terms of how we approach research and evaluation very much determine the kinds of questions we ask and the kinds of lenses that we use in analyzing our data. But I'm going to turn it over to Ken now to talk a little bit more about what the process looks like.
Sure, thanks, Cecilia. So at the point where we've decided that we're going to do front-end work, and particularly front-end work that involves having facilitated discussions with community members, one of the things that we do is we sit down with the team and identify things like who do we feel like the audience is for this exhibition? Who might special stakeholders be for the exhibition, and what are major questions that we have at this point? Who we see as the audience and stakeholders, it drives how we go about recruiting participants for the facilitated discussions. And when you look at those top two pictures, or there's a picture on the left, and that happened to be for an exhibition called 30 Americans and that's a collection of contemporary African-American art. So we had the need to recruit people that reflected our current audience, our typical DEAI audience. We also had the need to recruit people from the African-American community and to have discussions that were all the participants were African-American. That photograph that you see on the right, that was from exhibition called Nishad. And among the special stakeholders for that were folks from the local Middle Eastern Arabic and Islamic communities. And what you're seeing there happens to be a discussion where all of the participants happen to be women, and they all happen to be women that practice hijab. And then in the far right of that picture, you see the DEAI team, the internal interpretive team. So things that are slightly different in this process and what we think of as focus groups. So in focus groups, the team tends to be sitting in a room behind a two-way mirror, watching a discussion take place. And discussion takes place with a facilitator. But a big difference, and Cecilia talked about this a little bit, but a big difference is, you know, the degree to which a relationship gets built in that room with the two-way mirror, the degree to which that relationship gets built is just for that moment. And then the facilitator gets what they need from the folks in the room, and then those folks go on their way, and that's it, right? In our process, the team is in the room. There is some rapport developed between the team and the participants, but the big thing is that we establish a relationship with the participants, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that kind of continues even after this. But folks are helping us, they're collaborating with us, and then they are going to see the results of that collaboration, right? So they're, at some point, they may see that permanent gallery, they'll see that exhibition. And at that point, there are times where we engage them again about their reaction to what we did with their feedback. So getting back to how folks are recruited. So if we're trying to identify, to have participants that match our audience, it's easy for us to reach out to audience members and recruit them, or reach out to members, even though we try and have a mix of members and non-members. But there are people who aren't present in our audience. For example, we're in a community that happens to be about 26% African American. At any given time, only about 1 in 10 folks in the museum happen to be African American. So that might be an example of where we have to take special measures to recruit participants. Or there may be situations where we just don't have a relationship with folks from a certain community. And what we might do then are to reach out to cultural organizations, schools, religious organizations, in order to tap into their networks. And so we may say, give us access to your network, or we may ask them to send us the solicitation that we draft to their network. Or we may ask for them to, you know, would you recommend people that we could talk to? I'll just mention this, and then we'll go on to the next slide. But there have been situations where, because of what's going on in a community at a particular time, well, one, that the community may historically be sort of closed to outsiders. And sometimes there are things going on in the community at the time that make it where they're more closed to outsiders than usual. And we've had situations where we're trying to connect with people having difficulty. We're trying to reach out to cultural organizations, and they're not reaching back. And then we've been lucky enough to find an ambassador. And then by finding that ambassador, and sometimes we find that ambassador within our ranks in the museum, within our volunteer ranks. They make introductions for us. And then as a result of those introductions, then that community might open up to us. And we'll go on to the next slide. So this, what you see here are a list of the projects that we were involved in with Garibay Group from about 2010 to 2018. 5 of these are special exhibitions, and 2, the Asian Gallery reinstallation and the Ancient Middle East Gallery. Those are permanent installations. And And in the course of the work that was done for these projects, I think we engaged with, or we along with the Garibay Group, there were about, I think there were 35 focus groups or these focus discussions, and we talked to nearly 300 people. And we'll go on to the next slide now. So, getting back to the metasynthesis, and so this is what we did was engage the Garibay Group to go back and take a look at all of those previous studies to see what could be learned from that. And my colleague Sarupa always gets a little embarrassed when I mention this, but fortunately we had Sarupa there at the time, who is someone who is always thinking about what the organization can learn and how the field can benefit from the work that's done. You know, often at the end of a project, the folks in my department were moved on to the next project or producing the next report. And fortunately, Sarupa's sitting and thinking about how we can leverage what we have, or how the field can make use of it. So fortunately, she had the forethought to think, oh, maybe we could ask the Garibay Group to take a look at this and garner learning from it. And I'll turn it over to Cecilia.
Thanks. Maybe I can talk a little bit about what a metasynthesis is, since that's the term we're using. And so, as Ken said, there were a body of studies, right? So putting my researcher hat on, that's a lot of data, or a huge data set over time that we could look at. And essentially, a metasynthesis involves going back to original data and reanalyzing it to answer questions that were not specifically posed in an initial study, often broadening it beyond the specific one study. So in the case, for example, of the DEAI, the team wanted to understand, were there any trends or patterns that emerged across all of the studies that might inform future work at the DEAI, particularly with cultural communities that they had been engaging. And so although the 7 studies looked at very different subject matters and were with different groups within the Detroit area, we could look at that study. So for example, an original study might ask for a specific exhibit. We might ask questions about whether certain artwork from participants' perspectives fit or speak to the exhibition's main idea or big themes, whereas in a metasynthesis, we might ask more of a question of how do participants respond to specific kinds of artworks, and what kinds of patterns might we notice across the data, rather than bounding it by a particular sort of lens of a particular big idea, for example. The other piece I'll just say about a metasynthesis is, for us, is because we were looking at a data set of studies that we had conducted, there were a couple of things that we needed to look at. So from one of the benefits is that we were deeply familiar, not only at this point with the DEAI, but also with the main goals of each of the studies and the methodology and how those were conducted. And so we had that, that were pluses. One of the things, though, from a validity standpoint, is that we wanted to make sure that we weren't just seeing what we wanted to see, because we've been intimately involved with the data. So on our team, we made sure that there were also staff from the Garibay Group who could look at it with fresh eyes, and so analyze the data separately from those of us who'd been involved in the original set of studies, so we could really look for validity. I'm going to move over, or attend to validity, I should say. I'm going to move to the next slide, and Ken started talking a little bit about what the data set looked like. And so this, I think, gives you a little bit of a better idea. So it was that 7 exhibitions. The Asian gallery was a reinstall, so that is included in that. It included 35 facilitated sessions, what we were using as shorthand as focus groups. Sometimes we were beginning to refer to those internally in our team as community roundtables. We also conducted actually interviews for the Nishad exhibit. That was with core audiences there, because we felt that given the specific content and the specific issues around that exhibit, some of the core DIA audience team members might need to have one-on-one interviews where they felt much more open to say potentially things that felt quote unquote not PC, or where they could really express opinions that might feel unpopular. So we all told there were 428 participants involved in the study. If you aggregated the data in terms of the way that participants self-identified, there were 49 cultural groups or ethnicities, and there were 11 communities. And I'm going to move to the next slide, and you can see what those were. And again, these were self-identified. We spoke to a range of individuals. If we looked specifically at the communities reflected, you can see the list there. And that was partly, that list is partly due, as Ken said, highly informed by the particular exhibition and who from the community is identified as stakeholder groups. Whether they visit the museum or not is not really germane necessarily, but are they somehow a stakeholder because of the focus of the exhibition or the artwork represented. And I'm gonna talk a little bit maybe in the next slide about the areas that we focused on for today. There's much that we could share with you, as you can imagine with the data set, but we thought there might be 4 key areas that we could talk with you about and do a little bit of a deep dive into. And that's really the way that participants experienced and perceived the work we did together, issues of representation that showed up, stereotypes as part of that, and then perceptions of art. So at this point, maybe I will turn it over to Ken to lead us off on perceptions and experiences of participants.
Right, thank you. So there are going to be some things here that we talk about that are things that are not going to be any surprise to you. And I think Sarupa talked about that a little bit earlier. A thing though that I feel is significant is that as a result of folks participating with us in this process, and we'll use the word relationship again. So they've been asked to come in, to give their opinion, to give their perspective, and they know that there is something concrete that is going to come of it, and they get to see that concrete product that's the result of what they've done. So within the community members that participate in that, there's a great appreciation that they were able to participate, that their opinions were valued. You know, it's like, oh, you asked me, thank you. We're glad that you asked me. We appreciate you asking. The other, and the second point about it being considered innovative, and that's interesting considering that if the average person is anything like I was, that I had no idea about how museums operated other than what I saw on the walls before I worked in a museum, right? So I feel like folks kind of have no idea of how museums operate, but still they saw that the fact that they're being asked to participate in the process, they appreciated it, and they think of it as something very special, and they make the assumption that this is something that isn't done, and that is special that it's being done. No surprise that the fact that we are having these discussions and the way that we have these discussions, that it creates connections between the museum and specific cultural communities. So communities that there are instances where we've engaged communities as a result of working on a particular exhibition or a particular installation, and those folks may have had no involvement, or their community may have had no involvement with the museum, or maybe have had limited involvement and felt like, oh, the museum touched me or touched the community when they had an interest in a particular show, or they wanted us to be part of an audience for a particular show, but we haven't heard from them since, right? And so in this, folks are involved in the process, and there's a relationship that gets built. There is a feeling of an atmosphere of inclusion. Again, because folks are not feeling like there's something being taken from them. They're part of the process. They're working with us to create. There are folks that, and both in our general audience and folks that are what special stakeholders, that the fact that they've been involved in this helps to create a connection between them and certain aspects of the culture and art from particular cultures. And though this statement, I'm gonna kind of paraphrase a quote from a participant. It happens to be a participant who is Chinese, but they sort of said, okay, so having not been born in China and having not been back to China, being part of this process gives me a more tangible connection to my culture. So I sat in a room with folks from my culture, talked about aspects of it in a way that I don't normally. And so that process kind of gave them a different connection to their culture than they had. And then there's that point about, and we may have mentioned that, I should have mentioned earlier that we often make it a point to include multi-generations. And particularly with special stakeholders, we'll have younger folks in a group with older folks, unless, particularly with exhibitions, there are situations where we're wanting to have young people together with young people talking, or older people together with older people talking, but and we mix the groups in terms of generation. And sometimes what's uncovered is there's some tensions around some ideas that get discussed there. Older participants tell us that they're glad to have the opportunity to sit in a room with younger folks from their culture or ethnicity, and to be able to explain things to them. You know, that there's that, here's the thing that you don't understand, and let me explain this to you. And with that, we'll go on to the next slide.
And I think I'll add, you know, that just to what Ken said, a couple of things. I think one of the things is, because of the researcher lens I wear, is that the way that these were designed is because of that deep relationship, is that then it calls into, I guess, to the forefront, this notion of then what's the responsibility in terms of the museum to continue that relationship. It can be a very sort of almost colonialist perspective to go into a group, do the research, get what you want, and then say, okay, great, we're moving on to the next one. But the fact that these are, you know, 3-hour-long interactions with the team there, with a certain amount of transparency. And I should have mentioned, as part of the research paradigm, there is also a piece of looping back. We ask our clients, in this case, the DEAI, to be able to create a responsive communication with participants that were involved in the study at the very end, to say, here is what we heard from you, and as a result, here is how we're acting on it. And that can be an email, right? A thank you email with, here's high level what we found, and here's how we're going to respond to that. And so there's a level of accountability built into the research design. But it is really interesting to then think about, what does that ask of the institution, that I just want to leave you with. But let me move on, because just in the interest of time, talk a little bit about some of the findings regarding representation. One of the, I think, salient patterns that we saw that emerged across every study is really the concern around representation of non-dominant communities. And you can see here that there were a number of ways in which these were important. for those individuals from the different cultural communities represented, it was the notion of the heterogeneity within a group and making sure that that was clear. So Ken talked a little bit about generational difference, right? As one difference within that group, heterogeneity. But so the idea that don't really think about us in a stereotypical way, there's a lot more there. The notion of agency, right? There's a way in which often non-dominant communities might be sort of depicted as being marginalized or victimized or struggling. And not that those things historically aren't part of the story, but that there's also agency and resilience involved in communities. And so where does that show up in the story? The notion of cultures as dynamic and living, again, I would say one example is certainly with Indigenous communities, where it's like, you know, we're not like a culture that's old and dead, but it's a thriving, rich, dynamic community, and all cultural communities change over time, right? So that portraying that dynamism. Also thinking about the voice of who's represented and how does the DIA either reinforce stereotypes or begin to address issues. So a critical strategy in achieving those practices were this idea of first voice. So having perspectives represented from people or cultures directly or indirectly in the interpretation, in the project, how is that showing up? How are participants belonging to those cultural groups really, those voice, how are those being centered? And I would say that this issue of representation, these 5 points, we've now seen over and over in our studies beyond the DIA. So the ones that come to mind is work that we just wrapped up late last year at Crystal Bridges, also at the Chicago History Museum with Muslim communities, and that was from a historical lens, but issues of representation came up in very similar ways. And I think also maybe a year ago or two with the Smithsonian's Latino Center and the new exhibition that the Smithsonian is developing on Latinx histories shows up again. So these, I think, are very robust findings around representation that we're seeing often. If you go to the next slide, Sarupa, I wanted to talk a little bit here about stereotypes, and I want to talk a little bit about core audiences. And again, when I use the word core audiences, or the way that we used it within the context of these studies, these are the typical visitors that come to the DIA. So they're probably very typical to what you think of when you think about art museum visitors, and then participants among cultural groups. So across projects, there was repeated evidence, for example, that participants in that core audience often conveyed the very stereotypes and assumptions about cultural groups there was a concern they might hold, that the DIA was actually concerned about. So there was, but at the same time, there was also self-awareness expressed by participants about their own limitations and feeling, I think, at a loss sometimes for having to rely on their own admittedly limited understandings, right? So core audiences often didn't feel very comfortable at all with this, navigating this space, and really sort of, I think, held back, presuming that they couldn't really say much about those particular works or that particular culture. And I think that the conversations themselves really heightened that awareness, particularly in groups where maybe for the core audience, there was, again, that heterogeneity among audiences in terms of generation and so forth. And among participants with specific cultural groups, I think it just really emphasized the importance and responsibility of that the DIA held as an organization who holds power and who's very much esteemed and has a lot of regard within the city of Detroit. And I think among the museum field, really highlighted the importance and responsibility of the DIA to find ways within the work that they're doing to dispel those stereotypical sort of perspectives or reductive ways of thinking about and representing culture. One of the things that I'll speak to later, but I do want to, I think, preface here, is that among core audiences, there was also a lot of discomfort talking about these issues. And that was really clear, again, something that held across all of the groups. I'm going to move into the next slide, which I think is about perceptions of art, and hand it back to Ken.
Thank you. So the this is another one of those areas where the things I'm going to talk about that came out in the findings are things that are not going to be a surprise to you guys, because you see them all the time. But the findings show that there are certain things and certain types of artwork that are easier for folks to access and engage with than others. And so it is no surprise that works that focus on people are easier to engage with. One of the most popular works at the museum is one that's called The Wedding Dance, and it's a painting of folks at a wedding. So it's people-centered. Works that evoke are evocative of human relationships, right? So a painting of a noble woman and her children, right? Things that are familiar to people, things that people can relate to. Another type of work that are easy for folks to engage with were, for some reason, sculpture and assemblages that had movement, that could move, because people wanted to, they were curious about or interested in how things moved and what they did when they moved. No surprise, humor, works that show people having fun, works that poke fun but are not abstract. Those are easy for folks to relate to, easy for folks to engage with and enjoy. And I'll go back to that example of the dance after a wedding being one of the most popular works at the museum. Another happens to be one that it's called the Nut Gatherers, and it's one where it just shows two girls in a field talking to each other and enjoying each other's company, things that folks can relate to. Artwork that people have difficulty relating to, or works that require more support for folks to engage with, are conceptual art, work where it's not easy to see, where there isn't a narrative, or the narrative is not easy to see, charged topics, having to do with things like oppression or violence or difficult social issues, works that happen to be ancient or old. Folks need help engaging with them, and if there is symbolism, whether it's complex or simple, that's another situation. And then there's when things are ordinary or familiar. So you're showing me a water vessel, or you're showing me something from several centuries ago, but that is common and like something that I deal with today. And we'll go on to the next slide, please. So again, no surprise to you that if folks are looking at something, and we'll go back to, we'll talk about conceptual art. So if it's something where the narrative isn't clear, or it's difficult, or there's a lot of thought that has to go into creating understanding. So art requiring effort to interpret is often questioned, is difficult for people, or more difficult for people, needs more support. And works that are documentary. So let's say the work is photography or video. For some reason, people have difficulty determining whether it's conceptual or artistic expression, or whether it's representing an actual event. With and then, of course, there's anything that might appear to be cultural appropriation. So if folks have to question whether it is okay for this artist or a particular artist to have handled a certain content or use certain symbols, that's another thing that was challenging and that people questioned. And then there's questions around what's the authority what is it appropriate for the museum, what stories are appropriate for them to tell and to shape. And forgive me, oh, and I'm sorry, and then there's organization. So in situations where a show happens to be about an artist or is organized by a particular theme, those are situations where people seem to not have difficulty with engaging with it. But maybe situations where there are multiple artists or multiple cultures, and the theme isn't readily apparent. Of course, it brings up questions, and it's a situation where there's more support needed to help people engage. We'll go on to the next slide. When a work of art is we'll say by Western standards, beautiful. So it's colorful. It has pleasant subject matter, has pretty colors and pleasing characteristics. The folks privilege those objects, right? So this is beautiful, it has value. In situations where the artist isn't identifiable or there's no attribution, and so the work comes from a culture, folks tend to put less value on that type of artwork. And the same is true of functional objects, right? So so something that folks are familiar with, that seems common to them, and I'll use a teapot as an example. People place less value and less esteem and less worth on those objects. And explicit messaging, so situations where the work of art is clearly making a point or a statement about something that happens to be difficult. So where there is social commentary, maybe a discussion of race or power dynamics. So folks, and particularly folks from our traditional audience or core culture folks will likely be threatened by that. We'll go on to the next slide.
Yeah, so I just building on Ken's point, I think I foregrounded, I said the discomfort piece, right? One of the things that was very clear that participants in that quote unquote traditional audience, and I'll just name it, mostly white participants, had a deep discomfort addressing issues of race and works that explicitly addressed issues of race or inequity or social issues. And what was interesting is they tended to think about those pieces or frame them as somehow less sophisticated or not real art because they had a quote unquote message. And it was really interesting to think about, well, what does that mean? What does that bring up in terms of the work and the responsibility of the museum of thinking about how to address those issues, how to center those issues. And this leads me, I think, to a reflection around we're in a post-2020 world, right? So these studies were conducted certainly well before the pandemic, certainly before the sort of deep awareness at this point around racial inequity that we've seen over the last year as a result of the murder of George Floyd and so forth. And so one of the things, though, that I think about is what is the relevance of the study now? And my sense is that some of the issues that we've spoken to today really ultimately address or speak to issues of power and agency, which I think is really brings us to sort of the core of where museums are today and some of the issues that we're struggling with. And so I just wanted to offer that moment and maybe turn it over to Sarupa for thinking about, I don't know, opening it up a little bit here.
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia and Ken. You know, one of the things that we did after getting Cecilia's metasynthesis report at the DEAI is to come away with some overall reflections, and I'll just skim through these, mainly because many of you are already on top of the issues that are called out. But, you know, the findings that became clear were that participants were able to identify ways that even with the best efforts of scholarship research, the most sensitive team participants, that there were ways that the project might unintentionally reinforce negative stereotypes, reductive stereotypes. And so, you know, this connects to the work around sort of alighting and bringing attention to our own unconscious biases, implicit biases. So that's internal work, but it speaks to that critical importance of inclusive practice that Cecilia was talking about. How do we show up in the museum's planning and practices? How are communities involved? Where do our advisors come in? There's a great question from Pam Horn about what's the difference between an advisory panel and what we're calling focus groups. So I'd like to sort of get to that in a moment and ask Cecilia and Ken to tackle that. I think that with interpretation, this was another key reflection, that a consistent finding is that most participants will draw conclusions, often misguided, about the significance and meaning or history or context or the intention of art. And all participants wanted information or ways to engage that could help them understand context. And there was respectful desire to hear about what the meaning from a particular culture group and the sensitivities of people's own neighbors, what might alight there. Their preferences included first voice, storytelling, and artist statements. We know that there are many techniques and ways to cycle between and around those approaches. Evaluation, the primary purpose of the focus groups was to gather responses from participants about specific projects, but these multi-hour conversations are that opportunity. As Cecilia and Ken both have mentioned, we have found that they become that relationship building moment, an opportunity for meaningful community and visitor engagement. And it needs to be repeated. Culture changes. Whatever we're understanding as a stereotype in one moment changes with, as you know, a Twitter post. So these need to be consistently re-engaged. Stakeholders. This is a big one for me, that the broadest perception is that members of the cultures or communities reflected in our project, they become automatic stakeholders. They see themselves as this is theirs. And regardless of whether people from that community visit the museum or not, and or whether they do in the future, that can't be the museum's concern, even though it is. We want to broaden our audiences, but people will always see that the museum needs to speak to their futures responsibly through issues of representation, as Cecilia has mentioned. And finally, the art museum, Ken was touching on this, but the findings show that participants had preconceptions of art that may or may not align to what art museums, what we say are definitions of art. And so, you know, the context of the art museum was seen as distinct in its responsibility to present the individuality of the artist and culture. And sometimes the last part is divested from art museum practice, right? Culture, big, broad histories, that's a lot to get into, but participants saw and had a desire to see themselves, of course, represented and represented responsibly. So I want to have space for us to talk, and there are questions. What we were going to end with was a set of questions for people to consider and organizations to consider as they enter the work of either focus groups or these listening circles that have to do with how you engage your team, but also leadership. And this goes to that tension between what is a project specific need, but where does this inform institutional change? So I'm going to keep this up here, but we can pass this on. I just want to make sure that we have a little space and time for questions. So why don't we, basically, as a synopsis is don't get into this unless you're ready. Unless you, your team, your colleagues, the institution, if you're ready, you have to speak to your own discomfort, push through, and recognize whether or not you're ready to make changes to projects that we often get very deeply invested in, and commit time, money, resource to the kinds of learning that needs to happen. So let me pull this off so we can see each other and open it up. Does anyone have questions for Cecilia or Ken? Feel free to raise a hand.
Feel free to unmute yourself. I also have a couple questions that have been sent to me. So if you would like to remain anonymous, you're welcome to send a direct message to AAMI and I can ask those on your behalf. We just got one in the chat. What's a realistic time frame for this process?
I'll jump in. This is a very salient question because you have to build time in not only to conduct the focus groups, but for the team to prepare for our evaluator colleagues to conduct the focus groups, and then have enough time to debrief and to make change and reflect on change and be creative about it. So Ken and Cecilia, do you want to speak to what that prep work looks like on both sides?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So there's the piece about, the typical things, identifying what do you want to know and so forth. But often, certainly early on with the DEAI, we spent time unpacking who do you want to speak to and what do you really mean? So what are the criteria? If we say, oh, we want to speak with the Arab American community or the Middle Eastern community, what really does that mean? And who does that include? And so there's a little bit of that prep. The other piece that we didn't speak to a lot is that in the design of the pieces that we've done at Garibay Group, and the DEAI was actually formative in our design for this, was doing some conceptual testing where we mock up a gallery. So that visitors have something, participants have something to actually look through rather than just be at the round table. And so that takes time for the team to prep. And then there's the recruitment piece in advance. So I would say at minimum, so the quickest that some of these projects have happened are over what, 2.5, 3 months?
Certainly 2 months.
Right, and you have to think about your exhibit development schedule and where you're going to fit it in so that you can actually respond to those insights. That's a really good question there's a question in the chat that maybe I'll take, which is asked if you're relatively ready to start with, but given the current pandemic, can we do those in Zoom or can we wait? And that's an unanswered question. We haven't explored that as much. We have been doing some Zoom pieces. I think what you lose is a little bit of the intimacy and the relationship building. It's unlikely that you can hold a Zoom setting for 3 hours. It's just not going to happen. So you'd probably cut that in half with a couple of breaks. And so the intimacy that gets developed in the relationship building, I think would be different. It would take a lot more attending to. Is it doable? Absolutely. You can show people pieces, you can do some breakout pieces, but it would just have a different flavor. I probably would have to think through what the design of that might look like.
So we have actually tackled that recently. And you're absolutely right, Cecilia, that it is less intimate. Of course, there isn't the physical simulated gallery. What we're doing is we're sending out a image packet beforehand. And so far we haven't done, we've not done video. We actually did audio. So I guess it was more like a conference call, because we didn't want to privilege people who did not have the capacity to, or the equipment to be on a video call, right? So it was our effort to be inclusive. But we've had some rich conversations, but you're right, it takes like, you can't have people on the phone or on Zoom for a long time, right? So you're spending less time, but you can have some rich conversations.
Can I ask, to jump back to the earlier question, I think about the difference between an advisory panel and one of these focus groups. Could one of you outline that?
Yeah, I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear Ken's answer. I have some thoughts, but I'd like to hear what Ken thinks.
Hopefully this isn't a setup, but
it is.
Right. So with the advisory panel, the folks that you're looking to be involved in that are people I'd call scholars, right? So these are people who have special knowledge, special background as it pertains to culture, history, to whatever the subject matter is. Where with the focus groups, we're typically going after, so in the case of an exhibition, it's folks who we think of as special stakeholders and folks who represent the current audience. With a permanent gallery, you may focus a little bit on who you think might be your future audience, right? Because the installation is going to be up for, 3 years, 10 years, right? So it's serving a future audience, where your exhibition goes into place, 3 months from now or a year from now, and then it's up for 3 months or 4 months.
Sorry, Cecilia, I was also going to say a big fundamental difference is that an advisory panel, which to Ken's point, as experts, they can be academic experts, they can be community leaders. Those can be staff-led, they can be engaged directly without facilitation. I see these as fundamentally pulling in people who have their advisory panels are almost handpicked. There is a vetting, sort of more anonymity to the process here. So those are two key differences that I imagine and I think of here. So Cecilia?
And I would add that the other piece is that with an advisory group, it's limited, right? There's a certain number of people you can work with. One of the things here with the focus groups is that they're multiples. So we never do like one focus group. I think that's the one thing we didn't say. And any one of these exhibitions, you're doing multiples with the idea in mind that there is going to be difference within cultures, because one group is not homogeneous. And so you're actually looking for that, you're not assuming one perspective. And so you're trying to get as many different perspectives in that, and acknowledge that and work with that heterogeneity within a group. And then also look at that difference, right? So an important piece is not trying to find the consensus among a community group, because there's no such thing, right? And so instead thinking through, how do we bring these different perspectives together? That's, I think, one of the strengths of this method that is different than, I think, the goals of an advisory group.
And one follow-up question to that that I received anonymously is asking about the criteria for forming these groups. Does every exhibition or reinstallation get this, or only certain ones? How do you decide?
Oh my goodness. So so there are a lot of factors. I mean, there's time and budget. there was a time at the DIA where it was assumed that any ticketed exhibition would get this treatment. And that's not necessarily the case today. But I think, I definitely think resources and time being one of those resources, I think that comes into play. There may be other things, but that definitely comes into play.
I would agree. And I would say, you know, there for every one of these at the DIA that was done, there were, you know, half a dozen that didn't get this kind of treatment. But I think it's sort of looking at in addition to time and, you know, sort of all kinds of resource, monetary and otherwise. The other is, you know, what is a sensitivity? What can we already foresee as areas that we will potentially be swimming in unknown territory? And to the earlier point about inclusive practice, decolonizing practice, where do we not have a particular expertise? And where is there opportunity to reach particular communities that we have not engaged in this way? I see, I'm just gonna, Megan, I hope I can jump in here because I see Jane Deeney, who was our, at the DIAs at Brooklyn and engaged in these focus groups for an exhibition called Dance. And to this exact point, I was wondering if you had some reflections about that project and, you know, the goal to go out and engage with community members in this way.
Hi, Sarupa. Thank you. And hi, Ken and Cecilia. I'm Jane Deeney. I had the pleasure of working with all three of these professionals in Detroit. And now I am the curator of American art at Brooklyn. And I want to bring all these good things to Brooklyn. I would say, I wish I had a photograph of that. Maybe you'll send it to me, the list where your ideas will change, and they will, but they'll get better. And so so as a curator coming into the process and never having done this kind of work before, I was being educated and I was skeptical, but it was really transformative for me and the whole exhibition on dance. And I didn't think I had stereotypes or preconceptions, but I had to work through my own. And so, and the exhibition overall got stronger because the community involvement got stronger. So that's just one of the many takeaways that I have from that experience.
Well, another anonymous question asks, what advice would you give when museum colleagues always prefer to interpret art that is easier to engage and shun art that requires more support? Or in a similar vein, sometimes privileged audiences feel association over knowledge, information communication.
I will say that this is where the evaluation supports the need. It is the demonstration of where people need more, they ask for it. There's one great example in our, when we put the Asian reinstallation through a number of focus groups across multiple communities and presented many parts of the installation. There was one work of art that just was drop dead. People loved it, just flat out loved it. And it, one of the things that it tells you, this also happened with the 30 Americans focus groups, there are some that float to the top as works of art that people just automatically connect with. And you know that you don't need to do too much more with that, but reserve your time and energy for the much more difficult works, the ones that people, they will express what they are seeing. And that is where I think it can turn into a sort of surprise for a team that people are walking away with this misinterpretation, and you know that you need to get out ahead and correct for that. I don't think that needs to be done in focus groups necessarily. There are other kinds of evaluations that can help get at that, but this is where having a plan to do formative testing can inform the team outside of our opinions, interpretive planner opinions, curatorial opinions you're hearing from visitors. And it's a question of committing to what you hear.
And I would add that in addition, I think one of the things that makes this kind of design also attends to is really thinking clearly, not just about the sort of intellectual response or the way that we might assume someone interprets it, but in terms of issues of how it lives within the context of the rest of the exhibition. And so sometimes that's part of what creates issues, right? Is the representation or the ways in which the response to that particular art vis-a-vis the rest of the context that it's living in for that exhibition. We might not see that when we're thinking about it as just a work of art, right? And so thinking about that piece is all can be one of the things that this kind of approach can help with.
I want to mention too that I believe this applies to this, but during the dance exhibition, there were one or two works that we thought of as being problematic for folks from the local Native American community, from the First Nations community, and had no idea how problematic they were until we started the conversation with them. And Cecilia talked about that design charrette, and in the course of that design charrette, the participants actually helped the museum, like problem solved and said, here's how you need to deal with them. Here's how you need to deal with these. Here's how you need to talk about them in the interpretation. So it was a situation where at the beginning, the position would have been just those works shouldn't be in the exhibition, and actually the museum shouldn't even have those works, right? But in the course of it, and the problem solving that took place between the team facilitated by Cecilia and the stakeholders, there was resolution. There was a solution.
I love that, Ken. And we learned out how also who should tell that story, and it wasn't going to be me.
Right.
And so our advisory group and our focus groups and coupled with our advisory group led us to the right voices to tell those stories. And that was hugely important. That was everything.
Yeah.
Megan, I'm wondering, are you seeing other questions that we can answer in the chat?
We had one more, but I feel like we kind of touched on it a little bit with your last response about incorporating and addressing different perspectives within a certain community. Is there anything you would like to add on that?
So I see. So go ahead, Cecilia.
I was just going to say that it is, I mean, it's a challenge. But first of all, I think acknowledging that you're not expecting necessarily one consistent way in which you're going to get a response or in a sense, everyone agreeing. And so then it becomes an issue of understanding the nuances, right? So what are patterns that are really strong across all of the data that you're seeing and across participants, and where are there disagreements, or where are there different ways of thinking about? This is where an intersectional lens sometimes can really sort of play out. In this case, for example, I think Ken already mentioned some of the generational differences. Sometimes it's around communities where you had both people who were not born in the States but were immigrants versus those of immigrant parents who were born here. And those were some of the ways that we might we might see some difference, for example. And so really thinking about that. But then there's also the piece about the advantage of that across communities, right? So for example, the DEAI being part of Detroit was a big thing across every group, regardless of how you sliced, you know, and thought about them. And so there are ways in which attending to those differences means that you can then much better think about your interpretation and the nuance of the experience depending on where people sit. Sarupa, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, that I think you covered it so beautifully. I would add too that on the other side of it, this is where really creative interpretive planning comes in. The way to demonstrate perspectives through perspective-based labels or multiple voices on multimedia and audio tours. This is where you can the possibilities within interpretive planning and that strategizing to demonstrate nuance, to demonstrate and model heterogeneity. That's the mechanism of it that comes from this ethic of supporting in general, in not because there are differences of perspective within a particular culture group, but because we all should be modeling, this idea that there are various points of entry and different ways of looking at the same kind of subject and coming out with enriched understandings as a whole. So that's interpretive practice. On the other side of it, I would say this is the reason I've been just very energized about sharing this these findings is because, as you saw from the data set, like 428 people, 11 different communities, what we're coming away with are some baseline commonalities, right? If you can start there, you save so much energy and time and grief in some cases, and you can push your practice, right? So in that sense, it's the other side of the specificity within culture groups. It's also, as Cecilia was speaking to, that idea of pattern recognition. If all of these things are lifting up among all these different people, take care of that and go somewhere else. Take care of something else that is showing up as a different kind of need. So hope that covers it.
And the question about compensation, we do pay participants a stipend. So in the situation where we're doing focus groups and they would be 3 to 3.5 hours, we were giving folks $100.
Yeah.
And when we were also feeding them and paying for their parking.
Right. So this is something, thank you for that question, because I think it's something we sometimes just skip over because it's become such common practice for us. But that is a critical piece of equity, right? We will never do this kind of work if we don't also budget for compensating participants. And that includes not just an honorarium that feels appropriate. In this case, I think it was $100 reserved, but also, as Ken said, the attending to what time are we having these, people need to eat, we need to make sure there's parking, all of these components that are really part of making sure that we're attending to a practice that centers that relationship and that equity piece. And so for your locations, that might mean other things too, but it's something to consider how you're centering that.
Megan, how are we doing on time?
I was going to say we're over an hour. We're almost at an hour and a half. And I think this was a lovely way to wrap things up. If you have closing thoughts you'd like to share.
Cecilia and Ken?
Just again, happy to have been able to be with you guys and share. And we think of this as very important work and important enough, as we just mentioned a little while ago, that we're still trying to do it in the current environment, right?
Yeah, nothing to add, just grateful for the time and thank you. It's been lovely.
And I want to thank Cecilia and Ken again, not just for this presentation, but for this relationship over so many years and your dedicated and such sort of pushy, positive practice. So thank you for that. And to the AAMI team who organized us for today, thank you. And to everyone here, what a pleasure to see all of you. I would love to get more questions along the way, but I hope to see you at some of the next AAMI discussions. Thank you so much.
Everyone take care.
Have a great weekend.
You too.